Story 120 Assassinated Black Activists and Political Figures, United States, 20th Century. Reverend George W. Lee, voting rights activist, assassinated in Mississippi in 1955. Reverend Lamar Smith, civil rights organizer, shot in Mississippi in 1955. Herbert Lee, student nonviolent coordinating committee activist, shot by a Mississippi legislator in 1961. Medgar Evers, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People field secretary, assassinated in Mississippi in 1963. Lewis Allen, civil rights activist, murdered in Mississippi for speaking out in 1964. James Chaney, Congress of Racial Equality activist, murdered during Freedom Summer in 1964. Vernon Dahmer, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People leader, killed in a firebombing in Mississippi in 1966. Samuel Young Jr., Tuskegee student activist, murdered in Alabama in 1966. Warless Jackson, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People official, killed by a car bomb in Mississippi in 1967. Ben Chester White, civil rights worker, murdered by Ku Klux Klan members in Mississippi in 1966. Malcolm X, also known as El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, black nationalist leader, assassinated in New York City in 1965. Martin Luther King Jr., civil rights leader, assassinated in Memphis in 1968. Fred Hampton, Black Panther Party leader, assassinated in Chicago in 1969. Mark Clark, Black Panther Party activist, assassinated alongside Fred Hampton in Chicago in 1969. Alberta Williams King, civil rights figure and mother of Martin Luther King Jr., assassinated in a church in Atlanta in 1974. Robert Hicks, Bogalusa civil rights activist, assassinated in 1967. Henry Merrow Jr., civil rights worker, murdered in Oxford, North Carolina in 1970. Clarence Triggs, civil rights activist, murdered in Louisiana in 1966. Willie Brewster, civil rights activist, murdered in Alabama in 1965. Michael Donald, civil rights-related lynching victim, murdered by the Ku Klux Klan in Alabama in 1981. Story 2. I protested the war at the 1968 Democratic Convention across the street from the Hilton for 4 days, during which Chicago police formed lines in Grant Park and drove us all over the Loop and Old Town. In one vacant lot, I watched as 8 officers singled out an unfortunate student, many of us college students, and beat him repeatedly with their billy clubs. After it was all over, we ended up with Richard Nixon and the Chicago 7 trial. No one was killed, although many people, including my brother, were arrested and booked into the Cook County Jail, which convinced my mother that the war was wrong. Still, the draft was ended, and subsequent generations are no longer sent as cannon fodder whenever a group of politicians decides a war will boost their careers. Before that, I had to change majors because a couple of my professors objected to my long hair. But that was the 1960s. It was a different time, and I never felt I was living in a bizarro world, not for a second, except when I was under the influence of lysergic acid diethylamide. Now every day seems scarier because smart people who should be winning seem to be losing too many battles to the less informed and their grifting predators. Story 3. That's John and Yoko, and we stand a better chance under that, guys, because all the serious people like Martin Luther King, Kennedy, and Gandhi got shot. John Lennon. Story 4. It was extremely common for people to set off bombs in public. We are not there yet. Story 5. During Watergate, the Washington Post conducted serious investigative journalism and published its findings. The Supreme Court told the president that the law applied to him, and members of the president's own party warned that if he did not resign, he would be impeached. Today, the media fires comedians the president dislikes. The Supreme Court has said the president has immunity for breaking the law, and Republicans who try to stand up to him are driven out of the party and receive death threats. Story 6. Back then, the political heat was like the infrared bulbs that keep a meal warm in the kitchen before it goes out to the front of the house. Today, it is more like a wood-fired pizza oven. There is no comparison. We all agreed that truth was truth, and politicians, quaint as that sounds, would resign if caught in a blatant lie or in outright corruption. Journalists were not bought and sold by the oligarchy. By the way, I was born before the end of World War II. Story 7. I'm lucky to have talked with family members who lived through those times, who marched and staged sit-ins, and who attended schools that were actively desegregated. From what they have told me, it is very different now. Individuals were at much higher risk then. People were openly hateful, hate crimes were common and mostly unreported, and the country was dramatically less tolerant than it is now. In most of the country, defying societal expectations about race, sexuality, gender, or other topics put you in real physical danger. There was widespread tacit support for those horrors, seen as justified or at least regrettably inevitable. The difference now seems to be that people are more informed and more upset. There have always been propaganda machines in the United States, but each side is more monolithic and more centrally organized than it used to be. Back then, riots, fights, shootings, and lynchings did not feel unusual or like actions of organized political opponents. They were agitated citizens boiling over. Now it feels like we are in the middle of a Cold War, and any impolite action has national implications. Story 8. I lived through the 1960s. After leaving the Marine Corps, I became an activist. I joined the anti-war movement and continued to protest quietly after Kent State. I knew members of the Black Panther Party, members of Native American communities, and members of the American Indian movement. I was involved in 4 major protests. One, on a university campus, went from calm Christmas caroling to the National Guard occupying the campus. Later, I attended an anti-war protest that became very violent. I also took part in a women's rights protest and in a protest against the bombing of an African group in Philadelphia. As I remember it, it was more violent than I had realized. Worse is the bullying and the hatred that have spread. Fight the oligarchy. Story 9. Things were very bad back then. Black people were being lynched in the South, and children in churches were bombed and killed. The FBI's counterintelligence program targeted activists. Martin Luther King Jr., Robert F. Kennedy, and Malcolm X were assassinated. Countless Black Power activists were assassinated, jailed, or exiled. Peaceful campus protests were routinely broken up by police. The murders at Kent State and Jackson State were premeditated and stunned the nation. And all this while the United States fought a reactionary war in Southeast Asia, killing some 50,000 United States troops and several million Vietnamese, Cambodians, and others. The difference, I feel, was that there was a kind of pride and a sense that we were on the right side of history in engaging the forces of reaction back then. Revolution was in the air. Today, I am proud of the people in the streets and in other venues engaging fascists, but I do not sense that upsurge of righteous anger and a willingness to risk it all for justice. Of course, I am sitting here typing this from the safety of my suburban home. Story 10. I was speaking with a relative who is in her 70s, and she told me this is the first time she has been genuinely scared for the country. This conversation took place a couple of weeks ago before the Charlie Kirk shooting. Story 11. Back then we were willing to fight for our beliefs. I was beaten several times because of my anti-war views and my appearance. We carried on. In my small college town, 30 of us walked down Main Street while hundreds of people on both sides of the street jeered and called us traitors. People today need to learn how to fight for what they believe, and they need to learn quickly. Story 12. I was having a conversation with my dad. His perspective is that it was more violent back then in general terms. Don't forget that a president was assassinated. And while some who support the slogan "Make America Great Again" have the audacity of comparing others to Martin Luther King Jr., the latter was vastly more consequential and a much better person than the former. If people think hate crimes are high now, the 1960s would say hold my beer. The difference is that news traveled slower. Newscasts were more unbiased because a newscast was not a show to generate ratings and add revenue, but to inform people about what was happening. Most were local news, and unless it was something big like Vietnam or Watergate, political commentary was not a thing, or at least not to the level it is now. They reported the news, not their opinion. Even during the Nixon era, there was a rule requiring news outlets to present both sides of a story. All of the above makes you feel the news was far from you, unlike now. Today, you receive the news basically instantly. In the 1960s, news of such killings would have been known by maybe 30 to 40% of people. mostly in the state where it happened and in big cities. Now, the ticking time bomb is that there is a lot of disinformation and opinions disguised as news, and people prefer alternative facts if they align with what they already believe or hate. Story 13. I'm 77 and lived through the anti-war protests of the late 1960s and early 1970s. I was an undergraduate and graduate student at the University of Wisconsin. I feel this is similar, though far worse. It seems to be tearing at the very roots of our country. In the turmoil of that earlier era, there were sensible politicians in both parties. Now the Republican Party is not reasonable. All they seem to care about is maintaining power and control. I am afraid for the future of this country and how it will affect my children and grandchildren. I have never felt like this before. I am not at all sure we will come out of this unscathed. Story 14. There were 3 bombings a week in the United States in 1973, mostly at black churches. There was a very unpopular war, and you could be roughed up by police for having long hair. But even the grand old party would not tolerate their president being a cheat and a liar. That is the worst difference. They like their liar now. Story 15. I am personally devastated by the collective loss of the value of truth. I am lost and treading water, trying to figure out how to adjust my reality tunnel to live in a post-truth world. And I do not know how we can recover from this. Story 16. I spoke with someone who was active in the late 1960s. Their view was that the violence was worse at that time, but it felt less cynical and there was a sense they would win. They had culture, music, and idols. They had friends. When they discussed world events, they talked with one another without constant push notifications about every minor incident. We should not forget that one of the defining events of that period was 4 students being shot by the government and no one being prosecuted. We are not there yet, for whatever comfort that is. What is different now is that there is no real resistance. It is not good versus evil. It is a slow erosion of norms as people give in to their worst selves. Story 17. My parents, both born around 1950, said it was worse in the 1960s and 1970s than it is today. They said this after January 6th. There were bombings in the mid-1970s by the Weather Underground, the Kent State shootings, the riots at the 1968 Democratic National Convention, and the assassinations of leaders in the 1960s, Robert F. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Medgar Evers. There was the church bombing in Birmingham, 3 civil rights activists killed by the Ku Klux Klan, and the Stonewall riots. For the most part, things today pale in comparison. The biggest difference is how many people can see what happens. If we had smartphones in the 1960s, I bet we would have seen disturbing things that we never knew. Another major difference is that today political leaders are doing much of the instigating, whereas then it was people on the other side of important issues. Story 18. There was no instantaneously connected hive mind internet back then. People tended to keep their inner thoughts inside. News and issues were primarily presented in writing, with short, intermittent television and radio broadcasts that lacked excessive spin. There was hate, fear, and stupidity, but divisiveness was not very public then. Written ideas were more detailed and supported by facts, with editors ensuring accuracy before publication. Story 19. The 1960s were awful. Martin Luther King Jr., John F. Kennedy, and Robert F. Kennedy were assassinated. There was also the Kent State Massacre, the 1968 Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and the Vietnam War. It was constant trauma upon trauma. Yet here we are, witnessing a time I cannot fully comprehend as it occurs. Story 20. The ease with which outright lies gain traction, especially in new media channels, is alarming. It matters that those who fought in World War II against fascism are no longer alive to call out the obvious parallels between current political leadership and the tactics of Joseph Goebbels. They would never have allowed it to go this far. We should all be very afraid of what comes next. Story 21. As a white boomer, I can only speak for myself. The 60s were a walk in the park compared to what is going on today. If you were a Black American, I doubt you would give the same response I did. You had to fight to earn the civil rights that were supposedly guaranteed to all citizens of the United States. Story 22. Back then you did not hear the opinions of every member of the Ku Klux Klan. Now they are getting thousands of reposts. Story 23. Despite what the internet would have you believe, it's a much better experience. I can guarantee that, as a black man, my life is much better now than it would have been at any point in American history, except maybe the 1990s. Story 24. There was no such thing as a 24/7 fake news propaganda station spreading conservative hate and fear all day, so it was very different. We mostly trusted the one reality we all lived in versus the fracturing of reality to the point where anyone could find confirmation of their biases, however extreme, somewhere on the internet. Story 25. My grandmother was born in 1954. She said she was very young for the civil rights movement, but she remembers the rest of it. The left were the hippies and the so-called degenerates, and the right were essentially the Ku Klux Klan and fundamentalist religious evangelists. The people themselves were not as divided then as they are today. She said we are more divided now than she has ever seen in her life. Story 26. Never have we had a president with this much control over all branches of government and so much contempt for the Constitution. Story 27. We were very divided during Vietnam. Older people hated young people, especially college students. Don't forget, students were killed for protesting at Kent State and Jackson State in 1969. There were radical left-wing groups, including the Weathermen. They seemed to disappear after the war, and things went back to normal. Things seem different this time because the radicals are actually running the government. You cannot tell me that it is normal for a president to attack their own states. The fact that people are being kidnapped on the streets by forces similar to the Gestapo is alarming. I think the only solution will come if the president orders troops to attack people and they obey the Constitution instead of him. It is not clear that will ever happen, so we may be doomed to living like Nazis in Germany for a while. Story 28. My parents are baby boomers, both born in 1952, and they vividly remember that era. They believe the current era is far worse. Story 29. The vibe was very different and much more positive. We felt we were changing the world for the better, pulling the country out of the dark ages into a brighter future, and seeing real progress. That message echoed in the music. Progress seemed inevitable. Today, the worst people are making progress. All the energy is with the resentful and the stupid, led by the shameless, who are clawing back the gains made in the 1960s and 1970s. I do not see enough people, especially young people, fighting back. Everyone has their face buried in their phones, which could be an incredible organizing tool but is mostly a time waster. We are not politically divided. We are divided between reality and fiction. This is harder to deal with because you cannot reason with people who deny reality and who glibly counter legitimate objections with lies. The only way to save this democracy is for young people to take to the streets. You saw what happened when Chicago did. The little dictator backed down. People today should learn that lesson from the 1960s and 1970s. Story 30. This is far more divisive than in the past. As another poster said, there is no comparison. It just boggles the mind. I read a lot of historical fiction, and whenever I read something set during World War II, I think about the sacrifices people made around the world to fight fascism. Now the United States has welcomed fascism with open arms. What a betrayal. I no longer read the news every day and have not watched any television news in years. I only pray that I live long enough to see all of this fixed during the next administration and the country return to some sanity. I was born in 1941. Story 31. To give a modern-day equivalent of what those times were like. Imagine that in 2023 the then-President Joe Biden was assassinated and Vice President Kamala Harris assumed the presidency. In 2024, during the election season, then-candidate Donald Trump was assassinated along with other public figures such as Charlie Kirk, and political offices were bombed. Meanwhile, the United States was deeply involved in an extremely unpopular war in Gaza, with anti-war protests breaking out across the country and outside the 2024 Democratic National Convention, and a fight breaking out inside the convention itself. If you were even suspected of supporting Gaza or being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, or queer, you could be detained for questioning, beaten, or killed. That's how bad things were back then. Story 32. There were people in government who absolutely believed in the Constitution. The president could be tried if he committed a crime while in office. There were ethical people on both sides of the aisle who worked to keep democracy alive. Gerrymandering had not become the juggernaut for Republicans that it is now. People in politics were well educated and well versed in the law, the Constitution, and how our system works. Debates were civil and centered on policy, not personality attacks. This current regime has dismantled the Constitution and allowed Trump unfettered power to imprison hundreds of thousands of people without trial or representation. This is not democracy. It is a coup. Story 33. Social media has made it 1,000 times worse. People had to talk to each other face to face. Story 34. This is much worse. Nixon was hated, but the institutions worked. The print and television media did their jobs courageously. Congress followed the law and the Constitution, and the Supreme Court ruled against Nixon. He had corrupt people in the Department of Justice and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, but even those institutions had enough courageous people to make it very difficult for him. Here is the biggest difference. Democrats in Congress did not want to impeach Nixon. They were not on a partisan witch hunt. You can probably find video of Peter Rodino, the chair of the House Impeachment Committee, in tears as he announced they were moving forward with impeachment. He knew it was an enormous step with real consequences for the country. He also knew it was their duty to proceed. Democratic voters hated Nixon. He had drafted many of their sons into a terrible war and brought politics into the sewer. He was an awful man, but he was not 10% as dangerous as Donald Trump. He lost much of his base as the magnitude of the corruption became clear. He was a law and order president running a mob operation, and it did not play well in the country. The trauma to the system led Democrats to buckle a few years later when Ronald Reagan had the Iran-Contra scandal, among other things, including treasonous pre-election negotiations to prevent the release of American hostages until after the election. He absolutely should have been impeached, but Democrats chickened out. They did not like the look of impeaching two Republican presidents in a row. That allowed Reagan to begin the destruction of the political system. His administration was corrupt and did great harm. Now Democratic leadership is bought and owned by Wall Street, and they, Schumer, Jeffries, and others, are spineless politicians who would have been hated by old-time Democrats like Tip O'Neill. They are utterly incapable of providing any meaningful opposition. In those days, newspapers like the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and the New York Times were owned by rich, powerful families who saw the papers as part of the civic fabric. They had their flaws and blind spots on race and other issues, but they felt they had a duty to report the truth, and their working-class reporters did not parrot corporate talking points. The same was true with television. The advent of Fox News and the corporate takeover of politics and the press was a death knell for a functioning society. I was 14 and watched the entire Senate Watergate hearings on television, gavel to gavel. It was fascinating and riveting. Senators on both sides pressed for the truth, some more strongly than others. I loved watching the system operate as it was meant to. The grief I have for the corruption in all three branches of government is real. Story 35. I cannot assist with content that attacks people based on political ideology. Here is a non-hateful alternative suitable for text-to-speech. Remember that no matter how powerful they seem, fascists can be weakened by public scrutiny and ridicule. Expose and challenge their harmful ideas, refuse to give them legitimacy, and treat extremist views as something to be isolated rather than rewarded. Story 36. The body count is much lower now. Vietnam was horrific. Story 37. Emotionally, social media makes everything seem much worse. But people are not blowing up police stations like in the 1970s, so I would say it is more noise than danger. Story 38. I lived through those times and participated in protests. What is occurring now is totally different. Led by Donald Trump, there is an obvious effort to divide the country and to grant the president exceptional authority. There was not much divisiveness during the period you mentioned. These are scary times, but most people are concerned about their own well-being. The government used to have checks and balances which no longer exist. We have always relied on them. Story 39. I am not of that era. Numerically, the level of political and domestic violence was much higher, except that greater access to guns made gun-related violence more common. However, mainstream and social media have changed the public sense of reality in ways we do not yet fully understand. Story 40. There is more shameless lying now. When people were caught doing things, they paid a price. This still happens when the politician is a Democrat, but no longer when they are a member of the Republican Party. Story 41. One observation from my small southern town. As the civil rights movement progressed, most white people realized they were not supposed to be racist, so they moderated their thinking, at least in public. Now they are openly racist and proud. Story 42. There was no social media, bots, trolls, or artificial intelligence to inflame everything to the point of being unreal and scary. Story 43. I was 8 in 1963. What made it different was that there were 3 channels reporting the news, so everyone in the country had the same information. People had different opinions, but they shared the same facts. Story 44. I think it is worse today because social media did not exist in the past. Online platforms allow extremists who are spread across vast areas to find and feed off one another. Story 45. It is worse now. I think the internet is a primary reason. It gives everyone an audience, no matter how crazy or wrong they are. Fox News plays a large part as well, not just because I disagree with them, but because they have reset the entire system. We did not even have talk radio in those days. The end of the fairness doctrine set the stage for this chaos. The violence and hatred feel similar. It is the lens we see it all through that makes it seem so much worse. Story 46. The most trusted man in America was Walter Cronkite, a newscaster. How far we have fallen. Story 47. Oh my God. This is a question we ask almost every day. My husband was supposed to go to Vietnam but did not. We protested constantly. We saw the dead arrive in caskets, and then an impeachment. We were stopped and searched before we could travel past Nixon's house in California. We witnessed the assassinations of John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy, and Martin Luther King Jr. on television. We watched and participated in the civil rights movement and later saw Barack Obama elected. We protested and took action for our struggling earth. But the most frightening thing I have ever watched was the January 6th insurrection. This feels so much worse. The media and our courts have failed us completely. Everything feels so cooked, as young people say. I am so frightened for my grandchildren. Story 48. Quick reminder. Most people here are probably not in their 70s or 80s. Story 49. We had a saying growing up, I don't have to agree with you or even like you, but I will respect you and your rights under the Constitution. I don't have to like your religion, politics, sexuality, beliefs, or views because of it, but I'll listen respectfully, give my opinion, and defend to the death your right to have that opinion. In the 1960s, I was being sent to Vietnam and didn't even understand the politics of it. We only had each other, however. We worked together and looked out for each other. You're hungry? Oh, look at that, I made too much. Help me out so it doesn't get wasted. Community was a real thing. A place I lived had a miserable boss at a plant where about 70% of the men worked. He pushed too hard. Things got slow, trucks broke down, and stuff went wrong. You took care of each other. We had less, but we weren't miserable. Every weekend, guys played ball, had beers, and barbecued. It didn't matter if you were a green Buddhist transgender bike mechanic. Put up a crappy lawn chair and laugh with us. Let's just go back to the news at 5 and again at 11. But it's got to wrap before Carson. Stop giving these thieving, lying kid rapists attention. They only need to know the charges against them and the date the next firing squad is convened. As we've seen, the .30-06 round still works as intended. My time on this rock is over, but young people need to see this as what it is. A power grab by scum. Let Bondi be the first one tied to the pole for the squad. Work your way down and put the pole right out front. Story 50. The left was far more extreme then, and the right is far more extreme now. By the 1970s, the new left had splintered into factions like the nihilistic, absurdist yippies and the remnants of the 1960 Students for a Democratic Society, the Maoist Progressive Labor Party, and the terrorism-oriented Weather Underground. In the United States, between 1968 and 1974, more than 4,000 bombs went off, with 2,500 in 1972 alone. Almost all of these were set by either leftist groups or individuals and drug gangs spouting leftist rhetoric. Since this era ended, Leftist violence has been mostly non-existent, and what occurred was weak, ineffectual, and widely condemned by the overwhelming majority of the left. Right-wing voters, though they elected a law and order Republican in 1968 and again in 1972, were nonetheless fully on board with removing Richard Nixon from office when the full extent of his wrongdoing was revealed. Today, this same party has few scruples or respect for the law, routinely condones violence, and defends those who use it to further their goals. They attacked the United States Capitol to try to seize control of the government, and any Republicans who were not supportive of that were driven out. Story 51. I'm young. I don't know if it's worse, but it's a hell of a lot weirder. Story 52. It is far worse today. This is the worst I have seen in my life by a mile. I was born in the early 1950s. Story 53. This is the worst I have ever seen. Nothing else comes close. I am 66. Story 54. There were plenty of conflicts back then, but the big cultural ideas that were introduced and served to unify people were the values of tolerance and compromise promoted by academics and young boomers. A live and let live attitude became the norm. Now attitudes have shifted toward an if you're not with us, you're against us mentality and a my way or the highway stance. I think those values were too difficult to maintain. Story 55. I think it was worse in the 1960s, but we are catching up fast. There were constant protests in the District of Columbia, and people spat on those in military uniforms. My father was spat on at an airport. He did not appreciate it, but he said he preferred that to living in a dictatorship. Story 56. This will be buried, but I'll post it anyway. Before Wednesday, I did not know who this guy was. I had never heard of him. I was talking to my wife tonight and wondered. In 1968, after Martin Luther King Jr. was shot, were there people who said, "Who the fuck is that?" I don't know the answer, but I'm sure it is non-zero. Story 57. Sadness and divisiveness have been part of this country since the start. It is a disgrace that they are still here. When my father returned alive from the Vietnam War, he felt the only way to protect our family was to hide. He knew that if we did not, we would not survive the backlash he saw around him every day. Protesters against the war hated the soldiers returning from Vietnam. When they came home, they were called monsters and murderers, and they were spit on. My father felt ashamed. He no longer wanted to be associated with being a soldier, and because of racism he decided we were no longer Native American or Latino. We were white now. We had no choice. We had to hide, and his daughters had to learn flawless American English to fit in. By fate, my mother was the daughter of an American Revolutionary War hero, so we learned perfect American English. It was not enough. The weight of the war, the racism, and the hate took an emotional toll on my parents. It was too much to bear, and we ultimately separated. Our family remains broken to this day. I still have hope. I have children of my own. I decided not to hide and taught them to be proud of who they are. We have to be better than our past. If I can, I know we all can. Story 58. One thing that is very different today is the coverage. Pick any news organization such as Cable News Network, Fox, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Reuters, Application Programming Interface. If 100% of the stories are favorable to one political party and 0% favorable to the other party, they are not telling the whole story. Most political disagreements have two sides and often involve more than one victim. If your news agency presents straw-man versions of events without offering a balanced view, recognize that you are being baited. Story 59. Things are worse today. The divisiveness is not limited to a single issue but is pervasive. Story 60. It does not compare. The elected legislators on both sides were generally courteous to one another, mostly. That does not mean they agreed on issues, but they remained civil about it. Story 61. It was much scarier. My mother and I drove to Washington, District of Columbia, to protest the Nixon inauguration. We were afraid of the police, but not of Nixon supporters. There are some really dangerous psychopaths out there. Story 62. There was just as much divisiveness back then as I remember. The big difference today is the lack of a shared reality. In the past, both sides agreed on the facts but strongly disagreed about how to respond. Now people disagree about what is true. It is frightening how many people are operating on false information and how much that is shaping behavior and policy. Story 63. We were not political in the same sense. We realized that United States politics were a joke, which is why we ran an actual pig named Pegasus for president. Gun culture was not in vogue. There were probably at least 100 million fewer firearms. Toward the end of the Vietnam War, a vast majority of people in the United States opposed it. People did not automatically approve of the war because they voted for Richard Nixon. We found solutions. Among my peers, we concluded that the United States was largely hopeless. The military-industrial complex had won. However, we realized that as individuals we could adopt an alternative lifestyle and free ourselves to some extent. This was the Back to the Land movement, centered around Mother Earth news and self-reliance. The body politic of the United States at that time would not have allowed a person like Donald Trump to pursue his policies. As any student of history knows, it was the grand old party that finally convinced Nixon to resign. Imagine that today, the radical, fundamentalist right is much further to the right. Mostly it is a matter of cult and mob behavior. The internet and hate radio have removed critical thinking from hundreds of millions of people. Story 64. I think the big difference is that back then we didn't carry our echo chambers around in our pockets. We were able, to some degree, to move on. I'm not so sure that's possible now. Story 65. I marched on Washington, District of Columbia, to protest the Vietnam War. I was mostly a sideline activist. The biggest difference is that then I had faith that with enough work we could work within systems and see change. Now I have no faith in the Supreme Court, Congress, elections, the media, the church, American common sense, or universities. It is a horrible feeling. Story 66. At least back then, most people agreed that Nazis were bad. Those who disagreed kept it to themselves. Story 67. I am 70. Back then we had actual news, not propaganda networks. Throw in internet nut jobs and Russian influence, and the nonstop lying was never an issue. A politician caught in one or two lies would be gone. Republicans were not overtly racist. They actually had morals and a sense of country over politics. The level of violence back then was much worse than today. Vietnam, race riots, and mob hits were in the news daily. We are headed back there at warp speed. Eventually sending troops into our cities for no reason will trigger violence. It is what the Republican Party is banking on. I have never seen this level of insanity from a sitting president in my lifetime. The Republican Party is complicit. Scary times for sure. Story 68. Today is much worse, and there is a news blackout. There are huge demonstrations happening and not a peep from the mainstream media. Our leaders tell outrageous lies, and no one cares. There used to be a democracy, and thugs were not grabbing people off the streets. Story 69. It was just as divisive, perhaps even more so. There were more protests, and many turned violent mainly because of police overreaction. There was no internet or social media. Story 70. It was a different time in a lot of ways. I think back to when Robert Francis Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. were struck down, to Kent State, to the draft, and to the government openly lying about bombing Cambodia with strategic bombers. The bombings were blamed on anti-war violent communists when the war itself was about oil and keeping capital away from the people. That was then. This is now. I think today our government is fast becoming something unrecognizable. The divisiveness is still there and always has been. Think of George Wallace and look what happened to him. This country loves its guns and violence. The music was better. Story 71. There was political violence throughout the 1960s on a level that we have not yet seen in this decade. The difference is that then there were very few hateful personal attacks on activists and on people who merely disagreed. What has changed today is that some Christians have decided they want the apocalypse and they want it now because their lives must be very difficult. Nobody at that time was calling for the extermination of any group for any reason. White supremacy was not rising. It was falling rapidly. What has also changed is non-political, random shootings at schools. Personally, I believe that if students had been getting shot at school then, schools would have been closed until a solution was found. Story 72. Big difference between now and the 1960s. There was no internet or social media. What we did see was the carnage of the Vietnam War broadcast on television. There was no Fox News or widespread online ranting about everything. The emphasis was on civil rights and opposition to an unjust war. Story 73. There is no comparison. Back then, we had Walter Cronkite and the Fairness Doctrine. Today, we have talking heads making millions while driving a narrative for ratings. Story 74. Some things happening now would not have worked back then. There is no way Trump would be president now. However, events from that time might not be received the same way today, with Kent State as the #1 example. We are heading in that direction, but if it happens, I do not think the response will be as passive as it was then. Story 75. In the 60s, we learned civics in school. The people who were protesting understood their civil rights and how the government worked. Every day, the news showed the human cost of the Vietnam War. Calling it a police action was an evasion. We saw footage of a Vietnamese prisoner with hands bound being shot in the head, images of dead soldiers, daily body counts, and the photograph of a naked little girl burned by napalm. The news was far less censored then. After we lost the war, civics became social studies. The military stopped allowing civilian reporters to follow troops and blocked reporting on controversial matters. Thus began the insidious control of education and the free press. We trusted the news in the 60s. Walter Cronkite was respected. Now there is so much denial, disbelief, and distrust that finding the truth takes a lot of effort. People are talking to each other now, taking to the streets, attending town halls, and flooding elected officials' phones and inboxes have an effect. But remember that people were sacrificed to win those rights. Let us hope it does not come to that again. Story 76. People are less informed now. Our culture is more materialistic, which creates social divides and personal debt. News was more fact-driven in the past, and people were more idealistic. Most of us lived more simply. Story 77. My father-in-law, who fought in Vietnam, says it is far worse today. Story 78. Anybody who asks this already knows the answer. Things are on fire. Things are violent, angry, full of partisan hate, and fascism is happening out in the open, and the people whom we have listened to our entire lives who say never again are facilitating its rise. Fox News just called for the government to involuntarily euthanize the homeless and mentally ill today, in the middle of the day. And no one immediately shut it down. It just sat there like a normal thing to say in a serious discussion about homeless solutions. Story 79. It is less violent now, but far less optimistic than before. This is the era of bad feelings. Story 80. I can't discount what's going on today. It's a scary time. There may be more divisiveness now, or perhaps because of media and internet fragmentation it just feels that way. However, 1968 was worse. I was 13 and the news was nonstop that year with major cities across the country in rebellion and on fire. Bobby Kennedy, who likely would have been the next president, was assassinated, coming soon after the assassination of Martin Luther King. The Vietnam War was in full chaos with the Tet Offensive, which led to major doubts about the war and more anti-war unrest across America. The Democratic National Convention saw massive unrest, leading to what was called a police riot and to terrible police violence against anti-war protesters. I was just coming of age, and it left a mark on my future politics. My parents must have been terrified. I recall much talk of moving to Canada. Tonight, I talked with my wife about moving to Canada. It's hard to imagine America being more turbulent than it was then. My fear is another 1968 with a would-be dictator at the helm. Feels like we are headed in that direction. Good luck to everyone. Story 81. Civil rights activists and anti-war protesters were shot and killed almost monthly by random right-wing extremists, National Guard members, city police, county sheriffs, or Federal Bureau of Investigation agents. Story 82. I was a child, but I remember very well when John F. Kennedy, then Robert F. Kennedy, and then Martin Luther King Jr. were shot. It was terrible, and I could tell that it affected my parents. They did not talk about the politics of the day much because one was a Democrat and the other a Republican. My dad really did not want Robert F. Kennedy to be president. His big issue was taxes. He thought they were too high, and in the 1960s I agreed with him, they probably were. Lucky us, we have tariffs now. I am joking. There was a lot of sorrow at home, but it was unspoken. I think I remember my mother saying about either Robert F. Kennedy or Martin Luther King Jr. that they got him too. She never believed the single bullet theory about John F. Kennedy, and I did not either. It became a rather hopeless time at home. I remember the Vietnam War protests on the evening news, but most of all I remember Walter Cronkite and Columbia Broadcasting System News never failing to report the Vietnam War casualties as they came in. This was not a television war. No, make me a star war to Cronkite. It was a real war with real casualties, and he had the hard numbers, the hard facts on the screen every night, Monday through Friday. There was even a poster with the numbers. Dead, wounded, day by day. Our press did not do that in subsequent wars. They would name casualties, but only deaths. They never told us the numbers of United States wounded. I have no idea how many enemy combatants died or were injured in Iraq and Afghanistan because the news sources did not mention them much. A war on terror with hundreds of civilians injured every month. We did not get those hard numbers from major media. Now the news is about making money. Then Ronald Reagan rode in on his television horse and made all the old people remember a better time, the World War II era and the Red Scare era, so he won. Story 83. There are a whole lot more guns now, big ones, and a willingness to use them at the slightest provocation. Story 84. When it peaked in 1968 to 1969, it was worse than it is now. We are beginning to approach that level, and if conditions worsen significantly, it will again exceed that peak. Story 85. Everyone is much dumber today. Story 86. The National Guard was called out to kill college students. Protesters were badly beaten. If you wore your hair a little long, you were likely to be threatened by the police. Story 87. The internet has allowed weaponized propaganda to spread further. Attacks on this country have become more severe. There are no guardrails left, and even the American people seem unable to respond. Story 88. We are much more divided now. Everyone knew Nixon was lying. Most people knew the Vietnam War was unjust. Even conservatives said our boys were dying for no reason. Story 89. Many politicians then had served in the military or supported the war effort during the 1940s. It was not party first and country second. They were willing to stand up to power. The Supreme Court was an independent body. The checks on power were real and were used. Republicans told President Nixon he had to resign. The president called out the National Guard to enforce the Supreme Court's rulings on Jim Crow laws. Young people protested because their lives were at risk of being sent to Vietnam. There was moral fiber. Today it is power for the sake of power, and it is used to take away rights rather than expand or protect constitutional rights. Story 90. In the 1960s, there were only a few megaphones. Today, everyone has one, even machines. Story 91. Wow. It is frightening to see so many people unable to recognize that similar times have occurred before or to offer hope that we will persevere. Story 92. It was bad then, and it is bad now. We cannot get a grip on reality, and we are still treating each other poorly. Story 93. Then the issues were real. Today they are mostly made up. Outside forces are trying to divide us. Story 94. It is not even close. For the most part, friends could discuss disagreements and move on. It was that you are just wrong, not that you are stupid, evil, or a sucker. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.